Hello, this is How to Save Humanity in 17 Goals, a podcast brought to you by Nature Careers in partnership with Nature Sustainability. I am Monica Contestabile, Chief Editor in Nature Sustainability. This is the series where we meet the researchers working towards the Sustainable Development Goals agreed by the United Nations and world leaders in 2015. Since then, in a huge global effort, thousands of academics have been using those targets to tackle the biggest problems that the planet faces today. Each episode ends with a sponsored slot from La Trobe Institute for Sustainable Agriculture and Food in Melbourne, Australia, where we hear about how its researchers are focusing on the SDGs. In this episode, we look at the last Sustainable Development Goal, number 17, to strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize global partnerships, and hear from an American scholar who proposes strategies to break down these goals into manageable missions in order to make them happen.
So I'm Dr. Kate Roll. I'm a political scientist at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at University College London in the United Kingdom. I have a really varied background, looking at everything from veterans and disarmament up to responsible business, but a lot of my current work is around systems change and the SDGs. And the research, the questions I'm interested in, really have to do with things like political economy, who gets what and why, and increasingly, and very much tied to the SDGs, why does change happen? How and when does it happen? And an important part of my work is both my research, but I also lead the Masters of Public Administration program at my institute. And that's what keeps me busy most days. So SDG 17, Sustainable Development Goal 17, is the final Sustainable Development Goal. And we sometimes talk about it as being an overarching goal or a meta goal. It's a convener or facilitator of all the 16 prior goals. And so SDG 17 is partnership for the goals, and it's about strengthening the means of implementation and revitalizing global partnership for sustainable development. And sort of the key term for SDG 17 is partnership. And I think those of us who are academics, those of us who are interested in policy and practice, partnerships are absolutely essential for our work. Both collaborations within academia, with people from other fields, but also partnerships with organizations, with political actors, with students, with civil society organizations. All of that is extremely important. So SDG 17 is about partnership for the goals. And sort of the core principle, the core intuition is that collaboration is needed to deal with complexity. Multi-stakeholder work is really important when you've got problems that themselves are unclear. So, obesity, is this a problem of food systems? Is this a problem of transportation? Is this a problem of health? What type of problem is this? You need multiple stakeholders to come around and work on these type of things. Also, when we're working with uncertainty, when we're working around innovation, you need to have lots of experimentation, lots of small bets. And with that kind of work, partnership is essential. So that kind of intuition or principle sits behind SDG 17. But if you lift up the lid, if you look at actually the targets and indicators for SDG 17, it covers 5 really specific areas. So the first is finance, which has to do with revenue collection, aid, debt, base erosion, and profit shifting is a term we're very interested in with finance. Do countries have enough money to pay for SDG work around education, health, etc.? So finance is the first. We're interested in technology, digital divide, and technological diffusion. Third is capacity building. Fourth is trade. And fifth are systemic issues, which have to do with things like policy coherence. And SDG 17 is pursued in two ways. One is primarily through global alliances and organizations that are led by governments. So things like the WTO, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, and also partnership for goals on multiple levels. So again, these can be local, national, international partnerships. And finally, SDG 17, these are what are called means of implementation targets, about how we get there, rather than the destination, rather than the outcome. So we're sort of measuring, are we raising enough money to do this, rather than saying what the outcome that we want is. So there's some concerns, actually, that these sort of means of getting there aren't as closely tied to the outcomes as we want. But we're again thinking about these means of implementation targets. What do we need to do to achieve the other 16 SDGs? So I was born outside of Boston, grew up there, did my university at Brown University. But before I went to university, I had the opportunity to take a year out and work on a boat. And my sister had to pick my university courses. And I told her, put me into pre-med courses. I'm going to be a doctor. And she looked at me and she said, no, you're not going to be a doctor. You're going to be, interested in something else. So when I arrived back from that year, and I arrived to my courses for the first year of Brown University, she'd put me in medical anthropology, not in pre-med courses. And that sort of started my journey into social science, into thinking about power, thinking about conflict. I'd been living in Indonesia, so seeing people smuggling cigarettes over borders in these dugout canoes, seeing this incredible world out there. And she really saw that. That's what I was going to be interested in. So started to be interested in questions of power, of politics, of culture, all of these things. And that started to inform my studies in international relations, in post-conflict transitions, being in these areas, in Indonesia that had been post-conflict like Aceh, or in Papua New Guinea like Bougainville, seeing those up close and then wanting to go back into the classroom and really understand what was going on. So that really, really informed my work. And then, this interest in people and resources, in security, that's cut through all of these pieces, whether it's thinking about veterans in East Timor or responsible business and the poor in Kenya, or thinking about, do we have enough funding for education here in the UK? It all has sort of a similar question about resources, vulnerability, security, and how do we make this world better? So the big idea at UCL's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose is around bringing the state back in, around really honoring the state and thinking about its role in innovation. And we capture that idea. What we have on our tote bags, on our t-shirts, is the slogan, "Innovation is political." And I love that idea as a political scientist, but it cuts across, economists are drawn to this idea, designers are drawn to this idea, everyone is. Innovation is political. And what we mean by that is that innovation is shaped by political processes and structures. It's not just that the best idea or the best technology wins. We illustrate that idea by thinking about something like at the turn of the 20th century, there were more electric cars on the road than there were internal combustion engines. So why did that technology lose out? Was it a worse technology, or were there sort of political factors? So that's one way of thinking about innovation as political. But we can also think about, people can be involved in directing this process, right? We can make choices about where we want our future to go, where we want investment to go, in terms of technology, in terms of these sort of transformations that are so important in light of the challenges captured by the SDGs, and particularly the climate emergency. And, finally, this idea that power structures are involved. So this idea of innovation is political really drew me to IAPP, and this idea of rethinking the state and celebrating the state. I think the second idea that's really associated with the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose is the idea of missions and mission-oriented innovation. And this is an idea that's been championed and brought forward by Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who's the director of the Institute. And it's a tool for thinking about innovation strategy that beds it in a challenge. Why do we want to have, a competitive automotive sector? Well, we want sustainable and accessible mobility. What's the purpose? Where are we trying to go? And so it reorients innovation strategy around a challenge. And those challenges can be drawn from the SDGs. So this question of how do we make the SDG challenges manageable is such a good one. Because when we're talking about the SDGs, we're talking about the absolute biggest, most important problems of our day. We're talking about health, we're talking about poverty, we're talking about oceans, soil, all of these things. For me as an academic, when I think about tackling the SDGs, I think of using a systems change lens. Sometimes we talk about critical systems heuristics, which is just a fancy way of saying, how do we define the problem? How do we place a boundary around an issue in order to tackle it? Because that's one of the issues we see with the SDGs is that they're so big, they're so difficult that, how do we even get stuck in? So we can be thinking about a very narrow boundary where we're talking about local food systems, local change, how we deal with waste, or we've been thinking about much bigger national or international level systems and drawing the boundary that way. And then thinking about if we draw that big, wide and international boundary, who needs to be around the table in order to be thinking about doing this differently? And again, that's where partnership and where SDG 17 comes in. We draw this boundary, we think about the stakeholders within that boundary, and then we bring them together in order to really address the problem. There's some really interesting work that's been going on that's been using this sort of systems change, using this sort of mission orientation for doing that kind of change and tackling SDGs. So there's a great example from Sweden. Their innovation agency is called Vinnova, and they worked on trying to change food systems in Sweden. And their entry point was school feeding, which is such a smart way to do it because it's an area where their state is involved. It's got children who are making new food habits. And they did this incredible program that involved consultation with hundreds of people, including political leaders. And then they funded lots of different experiments all over the country around menus, around how the procurement is done, how even the cafeteria is organized. Lots of small bets, lots of small experiments, trying to think about how to shift this system. So this is a very innovative, design-led approach to using a mission, to using a systems change approach to tackle something like the SDGs, where we're thinking about health, we're thinking about agriculture, we're thinking about partnering, we're thinking about industry. All of these different SDGs are involved. But we also have missions, like I mentioned before, that deal on this much more international level or again, focused on placing lots of bets on the development of different kinds of technologies. But the SDGs, they're, big, woolly, hairy goals. And I think there's no way to go about them except for thinking about who needs to be around the table in order to make change happen. So missions are a relatively new idea, and how they're governed really varies by what level they're working on, whether that's a city level, whether it's an international level, and also what the goal is. Is it about innovation, driving more diverse and new innovation? Is it about social problems and social change? And so we've got a lot of diversity in who's working and accordingly in how they're governed. I think what is important is that we're seeing some trends, we're seeing some patterns of multiple stakeholder engagement for governance of missions, both at the local level and at the international level. So, for example, the Horizon program, which is a really important EU-level initiative, they've got panels of experts that help to monitor and govern the missions that are being pursued as part of that project, which include things like climate, which include things like addressing cancer. And you also see that kind of highly participatory approach coming with things like local missions, or with the example that I just gave of the Vinnova food system transformation, where they're doing lots of consultation, lots of partnership, and bringing in the stakeholders, bringing them into the room. And that really starts with the definition of what is the mission, what is important, but then also in terms of who's involved in executing the mission, who are doing the different projects that come together to advance that shared goal. And so, we're often thinking about things like flexibility, accountability, engagement, and then also building up the capacity of the public sector to do this kind of work. Because this might be flexing new muscles. This type of collaboration, this type of co-creation might be new for a lot of people. So yeah, those are really important. But they're all about, bringing together folks around a bold, inspirational mission, and moving forward, moving towards that goal together. One example of a mission would be around addressing climate change. Again, SDG 13 is around climate. So, thinking about how do we reduce the amount of carbon, how do we reduce the negative effects of climate change? And that big goal gets tied to a more specific mission, a more measurable mission, which, for example, could be 100 carbon neutral cities in Europe by 2030. So you take that big overarching SDG, SDG 13, climate change, you bring it down to a measurable, achievable goal of 100 carbon neutral cities, also still ambitious. And then you think about, what would it take to get there? What would we need to do to have 100 carbon neutral cities? And it becomes really an interesting question, and again, sort of a systems question, because you can't just be thinking, oh, this is a transport problem, or oh, this is an energy problem. You have to be thinking about the built environment, real estate, the materials that we're using. You need to be thinking about people's behavior. You need to be thinking about the social sector. You need to be thinking about all these different pieces that maybe hadn't been part of a climate change discussion before. Crowd in the different actors. Think about all of those that need to be involved. And then once you've identified those sectors, whether it be real estate or construction or mobility or energy, then you think about, let's foster some experiments. Let's help them think about new ways of working that could, again, move us forward towards that goal of 100 carbon neutral cities. So is that thinking about building reuse rather than building new? Is it thinking about new construction materials? Is it about electrifying buses, or thinking about new ways of encouraging more cycling? How can we do small level experiments that all add up and push us towards that goal? And ultimately, innovation theory talks about niche innovation, where you support something small, you foster it, and then hopefully it grows and then becomes the norm, becomes part of what we call the regime. And so by placing lots of bets, by doing lots of experiments, you're sort of seeding the future that allows for this greater change and these wonderful sort of cascades that can happen. So if we have that big chunky goal of preventing or mitigating climate change, we bring that down to the mission of 100 carbon neutral cities, we identify the sectors, and then we run experiments, we run different projects that all advance that goal, bringing these sectors and bringing these actors together, again, through partnerships, very much in line with SDG 17. So it's really interesting to reflect on this question of, will SDG 17 be achieved? Because as we started out with, SDG 17 is sort of an enabling SDG. It's not an outcome in and of itself. It's about, achieving the other SDGs. So, when we think about, will SDG 17 be achieved, how do we know? It almost will be, if we are able to tackle poverty, if we are able to support education, if we are able to improve gender equity, then we sort of know that we've been able to do SDG 17 as well, which involves resource mobilization, involves capacity, involves all these different enabling conditions. More technically, we can look at SDG 17 and the specific targets and indicators, and we can look at trends there. So, we can already see things like a reduction in tariffs or an increase in internet use, which are both, targets within the SDG. But I think these are really proxies. These are really stand-ins for the really important factors that we're looking at, where we're saying people should have equal and equitable and useful access to technology, that, the economy should work for people. So I'm actually less interested or less focused on those specific targets or indicators than the big, important spirit of SDG 17, which is getting the tools and relationships and financing in place that allows the other SDGs to be unlocked and move forward.
Thanks for listening to this series, How to Save Humanity in 17 Goals. Join us again next time for a final bonus episode, where we meet the Swedish graphic designer who devised the icons and messaging and the whole communication package for the UN SDGs. But before we do, next up, we'll hear our researchers at La Trobe Institute for Sustainable Agriculture and Food in Melbourne, Australia, the sponsor of this series, are working towards the targets set by the UN.
I'm Karis Bazaka, and welcome to this podcast series from the La Trobe Institute for Sustainable Agriculture and Food at La Trobe University in Australia. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands where La Trobe University campuses are located in Australia, and to pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, as well as to elders past, present and emerging. Across this 6-episode series, you will hear from academics at the top of their fields as they discuss groundbreaking research happening at the La Trobe Institute for Sustainable Agriculture and Food, also known as LISAF. Through LISAF, La Trobe has developed a holistic approach to food security, and this paddock-to-gut philosophy is delivering innovative research and significant academic and industry partnerships across the entire value chain. Its success so far can already be seen in the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, which measure university performance against the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. In 2024, La Trobe was ranked first in Australia and 5th globally for SDG 2, Zero Hunger. Now stay tuned to hear firsthand about the research of LISAF as it delivers innovative solutions for sustainable and nutritious food production in a resource and climate-constrained world.
The climate is well and truly changing. It's changing at a very rapid rate, faster than expected, and the impacts are starting to accumulate and intersect.
That is Lauren Rickards, Professor of Climate Change Adaptation and Director of the La Trobe Climate Change Adaptation Lab at La Trobe University in Victoria.
I've got a cross-disciplinary background, but particularly geography. That means I've come from a social science perspective, and what we look at is the impacts of climate change on different forms of work, including trying to respond to disasters, understand climate change, and do the hard work of greenhouse gas mitigation and adapting to future climates. So this is very, very urgent in the sense that if we don't get our heads around this, the window of opportunity to be able to work out what we need to do and to do it effectively is going to close, and we'll end up in just some kind of permanent disaster response mode.
The good news is that tackling this area of research is a priority for the Australian government. The 2023-24 budget allocated $27.4 million over 2 years to deliver Australia's first National Climate Risk Assessment and National Adaptation Plan. These will guide decisions on how to adapt to the country's significant climate risks. Professor Rickard says the research being undertaken at La Trobe's Climate Change Adaptation Lab plugs into these very live policy conversations.
The first thing that we're doing is quite open-ended empirical work in a range of different work settings. We're looking at the impacts of climate change on the work of natural resource management, for example. So all of the efforts, a lot of them unpaid, to actually improve the environmental outcomes and the biodiversity outcomes of our landscapes and waterscapes. We've got a range of different projects with catchment management authorities and others there. And that is part of my lineage of working with farm households and farming communities for a long time. We're also doing a lot of conceptual work to come up with the new vocabulary, the new conceptual frameworks, the new principles that we need to adapt.
An example is that currently researchers are quite good at understanding the impact of direct climate hazards, like extreme weather events or the effect of increasing temperature levels on food production.
Increasing nighttime temperatures, which doesn't tend to sort of make the headlines, but can make a big difference if you're an apple or pear grower, for example, and really seeking those cold overnight temperatures to set your fruit.
However, less work has been done in understanding the flow-on effects of these climatic hazards.
We're not very good at understanding the more indirect, cascading climate change impacts, and yet it's very, very evident that it's those secondary, tertiary impacts that we really need to pay attention to, because although the words secondary and tertiary make them sound less important, they can often be far more consequential. So it's not necessarily the floodwaters, for example. It's the fact that your supply chains are cut, that your infrastructure is affected, that businesses are closing, that environments react with a proliferation of weeds. It might be a long-term collapse of a road. It's these secondary things that can really cause a huge amount of harm if we don't manage them well. So our hope is that if we have a more comprehensive, a more realistic sense of what climate change entails, so building on the fairly limited climate-focused approach that we've had to date, then we'll be able to identify a whole range of new, effective and creative and innovative climate change adaptation options.
The far-reaching impacts of climate change mean these adaptation options also have a lot of crossover.
A lot of adaptation looks a lot like good governance. It looks like building social well-being. It looks like building environmental sustainability. So suddenly we've got this connection through to a whole host of existing policy agendas, things that we have a lot of skills and capacity to do. And that's really exciting for adaptation. It becomes far less about expertise, in particular climatic domains, far less about exposure models, and far more about how can we work together to get ourselves as positioned as safely and securely as possible to cope with whatever comes next.
It also means Professor Rickard's research taps into all of the SDGs, but especially SDG 13 on climate change action.
But as I've indicated, our conceptualization of the challenge of climate change impacts and adaptation means we're looking across all of the different areas of work that the different SDGs represent, whether that's the health sector and education sector, whether it's the water sector, the agricultural sector. The sorts of research we're doing, including particular work with the National Climate Risk Assessment, really reinforces to us the importance of governance. And that focus and ongoing dialogue about governance is, I think, very much resonant with the 17th SDG, which is about partnership. The only other thing I would say is that actually our work also has caused us to question one or two elements in the SDGs, accepting that, of course, it's this grand vision. It's a big transformational vision that was brought together through hard work of partnership between a lot of countries. And for us in SDG 8, it talks about decent work or good jobs and economic growth. We are very much drawn to the work of those who are questioning whether economic growth is the kind of metric of societal progress that we really need in a changing climate. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because all the hard work of building community, building relationships, social capital, a lot of that gets left outside of a classic economic lens. And at the same time, stuff that really ought not to be celebrated also gets included. So if we have large-scale disasters causing large amount of losses of assets, infrastructure, and then we rebuild those, that can show up as a positive in terms of economic development, economic growth. So the question is it really the right compass for us? And our research is increasingly suggesting that we need to rethink that one.
Professor Rickard's immediate next focus will be on big picture questions around climate change adaptation.
Like, how do we know whether adaptation's been successful? What's the purpose of it? What's the vision of it? It's very much about social and ecological well-being. It's about the foundational economies. It's about everything that we know helps to sustain us and for us to thrive. And so that opens up a big vista of different types of work that are required there. One of the other things we're doing is really starting to question things like what work is essential, what work matters, how work should be remunerated, what forms of infrastructure are critical.
Researchers in climate change adaptation also face an unusual hurdle.
Unlike the typical idea of the researcher or the academic being in an ivory tower disconnected from the world, we are living this, we are part of it. And that has a huge range of effects on our actual ability to complete research successfully. As individuals, for example, we may be affected. So I was doing a project on the effects of drought on farm households in northwest Victoria. I trained up local women in the community to help with that research. And one of them was unable to do the interviews because her house was flooded in the 2010-2011 floods.
In this way, the research focus area is also impacting the researcher themselves.
I think there's something about rural and regional communities that really understand this. Your professional self and your personal self are always so closely enmeshed. But another thing that we're finding all of the time is that research funders, research partners, all the sorts of organisations we work with, including, I should say, the media, are themselves being impacted and are very distractible. And so we'll be trying to sort of do something, particularly the long-term, future-oriented climate change adaptation, and it keeps getting disrupted. People leave, funding dries up, interest dries up, policy windows close, policy windows open. It's just this real difficulty of ever getting ahead. How do we actually start to make sense of these when we're so drawn into turmoil? And one of the key risks that we identified for Australia is actually the risk of what we called institutional overwhelm. So our institutions, but more broadly organisations, are starting to unravel because we're so caught up in the uncertainty, the volatility, the extremes that climate change is already throwing at us. That's a real concern when it comes to all of the extremely time-intensive, energy-intensive work that good climate change adaptation requires. So we need to actually become really, really expert at putting together strategic visions and plans that we can then use to keep sketching out what the future looks like as we're driving towards it.
Achieving that vision will require a combined effort. As we've heard through this podcast series, that is the LISAF vision, to bring together researchers across disciplines for a holistic approach.
My hope is that we have, as a society, a real opportunity and rapid engagement with the challenges of adapting to our increasingly changing climate. We really, really need to work collectively to ensure that we're adapting in the right direction in a way that's going to be effective. And we really need everybody engaged in it. It's not the sort of thing that anyone can just take a backseat on. Each and every person, household, organisation, location has to be involved. So I'm really hoping that we will get there. It also, as part of that, needs to be really seen as a complement, and in fact a foundation for the hard work of greenhouse gas mitigation or decarbonisation. The two things enable each other, so they have to be done in partnership. So I hope that we move past some of the sort of older simplistic idea that it's one or the other, or that they're somehow antithetical to each other. So with that, hope that our lab continues to be part of that conversation, part of the policy change, the practice change. We certainly feel really poised, ready to make a big difference. So hopefully that will come to fruition.
That was Lauren Rickards, Professor of Climate Change Adaptation and Director of the La Trobe Climate Change Adaptation Lab at La Trobe University in Victoria. Join us for the next episode in this series, where we will be looking at the role AI and digital agriculture is playing, and will continue to play, in food security and sustainability.